Today, we are going to hear a briefing from the Financial and Fiscal Commission on its 2022-2023 submission for the Division of Revenue. And we're going to receive a briefing from Provincial Treasury on 2020-2021 fourth quarter performance, financial and non-financial. We will also then deal with some committee administration regarding minutes and quarterly reports, followed by our usual resolutions and actions. Colleagues, I'm going to allow members to quickly introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump into the FFC presentation first. The delegation is led by Ms. Rockman, and then we will jump straight into, we'll have questions and answers, and then we'll have the Provincial Treasury Premier presentation. The Minister of Finance, thank you, welcome also to our meeting today. He has submitted an apology that he's able to stay for first hour before he has to jump into a Lohotla, and then he will be joining us later again in the meeting. But with that, colleagues, if you could just introduce yourselves, please.
Good morning, Chairperson, Ricardo Mackenzie.
Good morning, Chair and colleagues, Wendy Philander.
Morning, Chairperson and the members of the committee, Lulama Mvimbi.
Good morning, Chairperson and all the members of the Budget Committee. Good morning.
Morning, Chairperson and member Nomi Nkondlo.
Welcome, everyone.
Good morning,
I haven't seen you
Chairperson.
in such a long time.
Good morning, Chairperson. Regan Allen, alternate member. Morning.
Welcome, Member Allen. Okay. FFC, Ms. Rockman, you're online?
Good morning, Chairperson. Yes, we are ready.
Perfect. If you could just introduce your delegation and then you can jump straight into the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I will ask Mr. Chen, who's our Director Research, to introduce the rest of the delegation who's with us. Thanks.
Okay, good morning, and thank you, Honourable Chair and members. So my name is Chen Sang, Head of Research at the Financial and Fiscal Commission. I have with me, who will also present after me, is Dr. Mkhululi Kube, and then followed by Mr. Thando Ngozo. So if I may, Chair, with your permission, shall I start with the presentation?
Yes, please.
Chen, yeah, let me make introductory remarks and then I'll hand over to you and then we will run through the sequence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Honourable Chairperson and members. We appreciate this opportunity to present our 2022-23 annual submission on the Division of Revenue. The submission is made against the backdrop of a very fragile economic environment amidst the country's second recession in a decade. The pandemic has posed many challenges, including the efficacy of our macro-fiscal system in accommodating pandemic-induced challenges. It has also intensified the existing inequalities and condemned many people to unemployment and poverty. Questions abound on the impact of the pandemic on the state's fundamental obligation, that is the progressive realization of citizens' basic rights as enshrined in the Constitution. Such questions arise because the pandemic has highlighted the inadequacies in access to basic services and food, both in terms of quantity and quality, and has in fact heightened imbalances and conflicts in society, especially when considering the gender dimension. It has further exposed inadequacies in the country's oversight, accountability and leadership mechanisms. Provincial and local government will continue to bear the impact of funding cuts and revenue losses for quite some time, and we will have to find ways and means to adjust to a constricted fiscal environment whilst mitigating against service delivery losses. The theme of this submission is the effects of COVID-19 and the changing architecture of subnational government financing in South Africa. The Commission believes that a comprehensive and evidence-based analysis of the socio-economic impact of the pandemic is key to developing a set of The Commission believes that a comprehensive and evidence-based analysis of the socio-economic impact of the pandemic is key to developing a set of informed recommendations that can contribute to turning around the economy to achieve an inclusive and sustainable growth trajectory. Its recommendations subsequently seek a recovery process that is sustainable and leaves no one behind. The context within which the submission is made is informed by, amongst others, the following: growth in gross domestic product, unemployment, the budget deficit and gross debt to GDP, provincial average annual growth, sectoral contributions to the provincial economy and tourism. And it is structured in 4 major parts, namely the macroeconomic impact of COVID-19, the impact on local government, thirdly, the impact on people's lives and the Bill of Rights, and fourthly, oversight and leadership. And I'm going to hand over to Mr. Chen, and we will start the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. Again, Honourable Chair members, okay, so without spending more time on the book's cover, let's look at the context within which the submission is tabled. As you know, the theme for this year is about the effects of COVID-19 and the changing architecture of subnational government financing in South Africa. So the shock of COVID-19 pandemic was significant, as clearly stated here, with the jolt of a negative 51.7% decline in annualized quarter-to-quarter change in Q2 of 2020 last year, to this sudden sort of rebound, 67.3% on the production side. However, that is not exactly a good news, because if one looks over the year, we are still at lower level of production as pre-crisis levels. On the demand side, firms are busy restocking. This is the latest stats as the first quarter of 2021. Consumption resumed marginally, but importantly, trade is still quite in the negative region, meaning that it is quite muted in terms of activities. GDP by industry showed roughly the same trend, with the volatility caused obviously by the lockdown and as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. The marked lift by the pandemic is much more pronounced and permanent, especially in the labor market, at now this 32.5% by the official definition, and that means that the active job seekers that cannot find jobs, and 43.2% if we use the unofficial definition, that is just plainly without jobs. The fiscal position has deteriorated, with gross debt to GDP reaching above 80%. Provincially, the disaggregated regional data for GDP, however, masks the idiosyncrasies in growth between provinces, and thus the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Remember that the regional projections are generally all estimated, until further later down the line that more sort of localized surveys are conducted. So looking back, finance, let's remind ourselves, the finance, real estate and business services continue to be key contributors to the provincial economy and overall in general. This slide, however, shows the distribution of tourism and as its focus, arrival and departures for 2020 through the airports. We see around this 20% of tourists or arrivals and departures go directly through the Cape Town, excluding, I should note, transits. So one should also take this information also at arm's length. This, however, is much more interesting, which I just added last night, so you wouldn't see it in the pack, but we're happy to update it. We see this total devastation, especially at the 2020 year, caused by the COVID-19 pandemic on the tourism industry. That, Honourable Chair members, is a 70% drop-off between 2019 and 2020 in terms of numbers of tourists entering South Africa, whether via whichever means. And of course, the lockdown and travel restrictions imposed has had a negative impact on provinces in general and also across South Africa. This graph shows the latest figures of the unemployment rates by province. And With that as the context, allow me to move into Chapter 2, measuring the macroeconomic and fiscal impact of COVID-19 in South Africa. We note that the COVID-19 pandemic and imposition of the nationwide lockdown triggered the most significant recession in South Africa's economic history. Inefficiencies in public sector service provision combined with the pandemic's shock on overall productivity led to the highest levels of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. What essentially we'd like to emphasize here is that we didn't get here by just because of COVID or because of a short-term events. It's been years in the making, essentially, that culminated to where we are today. Supply and productivity were adversely, of course, affected through mass unemployment and deficiencies in total factor productivity growth. On the demand side, as shown in this graph, shocks to consumption and investment in 2020 Q2 contributed to the fall in aggregate demand. Depletion at the time in inventory stocks and a lack of imports and trade activities undermined a swift growth recovery through consumption. In other words, the likelihood of a swift recovery through either pushing for demand or pushing for spending, it's rather unproductive and or quite impossible in the short term, as well as perhaps over the medium term, because if you look at the public and private investments as part of the aggregate demand, it's also it's still in the negative region. In an annual submission, examining the financial stability shows that the producer prices rose as a result of lockdowns, adversely affecting consumer purchasing power. For normal people, as in retail sales and consumption, higher consumer prices, especially for core items, this is in the book but not here presented, affected the affordability of goods for poorer households. In fact, just last night we saw on the news that there is a surge in consumer prices by random surveys of, I think it's in the Gauteng region that they conducted that study. And what we've done or what we've researched as a commission in the annual submission, we found is that there is a divergence whenever there's this COVID-19 impact, crisis impact, especially around a lockdown, it diverges the core versus non-core price index, whereby core, so food, shelter, things like that, non-alcoholic beverages, the price shot up. In this graph on the slide, though, we are looking at the fiscal space of the primary balance, and it, of course, deteriorated even before and further with the onset of COVID-19. The fiscal impulse has thus been compelled towards a consolidatory stance. So remember, at the beginning of this year, there was, as tabled in the budget by the minister, is that we shall undertake a consolidatory stance over the medium term. In terms of revenue, we see that an increase in the concentration in dependency on personal income tax as well as the value-added tax. So in other words, it moving towards this very consumption-based or income-based, labor market-based type of public revenue. And that has even made our fiscal revenue overall generally quite vulnerable to a crisis such as COVID-19. This is all in the annual submission, but not precisely presented here. And most importantly, our research shows that leakages, fiscal leakages in particular, undermine any positive spillover effects that economic growth has on reducing the public debt burden. So basically, no matter how much money we throw at the problem to trying to stimulate the economy, with the amount of fiscal leakages that is currently and or has been in the system, the economy will simply not grow. We, the Commission, therefore, makes the following recommendations in this chapter based on the evidence research. First, we need alignment of the economic reconstruction and recovery plan across the three spheres of governance, especially between provincial and national, committed in the 2022 division of revenue. In other words, we don't just want an economic plan aligned, but also that it needs to, in some ways, feature in with financial commitments. Secondly, we reiterate our recommendation from last year to localize a product value chain and procurement for inclusive growth and job growth. We still haven't seen what product is South Africa going to say this is proudly South Africa product that we're going to focus on. And we encourage the provinces and ministers of finance to eliminate fiscal leakages in the system through reprioritizing, merging, and downsizing departments in general. Unfortunately, Chair, I hear a lot of background noises. Can I just ask
Colleagues, if we could just keep our mics off. What I'm going to do, let me just quickly see. Okay, I'm putting 1 or 2 mics off clear. Yes, those are all that I can see. Thanks. You may go ahead.
Thanks very kindly, Chair. So in Chapter 3, we look at measuring the effectiveness of government expenditure for performance. So we looked at the following things. Fiscal multiplier effect in relation to economic growth and social development. Second, alignment and effectiveness of government performance indicators. So this is all an APP, SP, and all those things, and its mandates and purposes. Then the size and shape of the wage bill. And lastly, the program and performance-based budgeting in relation to the efficiency, and we calculated the effectiveness of government expenditure in general. On the fiscal multiplier effects, we find that the most ambiguous outcomes actually in multiplier effects of small magnitudes, uncertain, statistically uncertain. That is increasing growth, reducing poverty and unemployment. But remember that it is essentially non-distinguishable from being no effect. On the KPIs, we find no shortages of KPIs, but with persistent variances due to lack of accountability and consistency in that sort of standard of measure. On the wage bill, this result shows that it is larger than any other international comparators, which will be shown in the next slide. Lastly, spending efficiency of the government's, the research suggests that about 80% looks kind of okay. But the question is 80 cents on the rand should not be celebrated without asking where did the other 20 cents go. This slide just very quickly showing how our government compensation employees expenditure as a percentage of GDP is above developing and even some or other advanced economies. With these research results, this chapter very quickly recommends the minister as the custodian of the national resource and the fiscal envelope to enhance the consistency and coherency of the department's KPI to the financial commitments of their budget via the MTEF technical guidelines, and seek to incentivize as opposed to resorting to this business as usual reporting KPIs, simply reporting on a progress, essentially. Second, the public sector wage bill across all spheres of government should be reviewed to reduce. And last, we recommend the Minister of Finance to pay attention, to the movement in the multiplier effect of expenditure, of government expenditure, as the economic environment is still changing due to, of course, the COVID-19. Next, I shall hand over to Dr. Ngube.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Chairperson. I'm going to take you through chapters 4, 5, 7, and 8. And these are chapters on the local government, the impact of COVID on the local government. Chapter 4 is on the impact of the COVID on the local government sphere. We know that this sphere was actually having severe hardships even before the COVID pandemic hit the country. There were many challenges the sector was facing, but the COVID pandemic simply amplified or exacerbated some of these challenges. So in this particular chapter, we tried to isolate the impacts of COVID on the local government sphere. And basically, we're asking ourselves, what is the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the fiscal framework of the local government and how this particular sphere could be sufficiently repositioned to turn around the local government sector. So our findings on this particular chapter, next slide. Our findings on this particular chapter are that as of December 2020, we see that the sector had spent almost 25 billion on the COVID pandemic, and largely this spending was on the metros, 8 metros. They had spent out of that 25 billion, 64% was accounted for by the 8 metros. And as you remember, the COVID grant to the local government sector of around 11 billion was actually, most of it was actually spent by the metros. So that really paints the picture that the metros were suffered immensely from the COVID pandemic. Then in terms of other variables, we looked at revenues, the impact of COVID on local government revenues and the impact of COVID on the local economic debt. Next slide, which looks at the impact of the COVID pandemic on municipal owned revenues. We see that if you look at that graph on the right-hand side, you'll see that the red bars there shows the owned revenue collection before the COVID pandemic. Then the green and purple bars show post-COVID, during the COVID period. What we see there is that the COVID had a negative or adverse effect on the revenues of the local government sector and largely on small rural municipalities. We see, if you look at the B2, B3, B4s there on the graph, we see that there's been a sliding effect there. The knock-on effect was very severe on those municipalities. But we see that the metros and the B1 or secondary cities or intermediate cities, as we sometimes call them, they were affected initially, but there has been some rebounding, especially in the second quarter of the pandemic. So we see that rebounding, which to us suggests some financial resilience within the metros and the B1 municipalities. So some of the reasons is that these metros have diversified revenue bases compared to rural and small municipalities. The implication of that is that it is important for municipalities to diversify their revenue bases. Next slide. The next slide looks at the individual revenue streams, how they were affected by the COVID pandemic. What we see there, the worst affected were the water, sanitation, and refuse removal revenue streams. This is due to things like social distancing regulations and relaxation of credit controls. And property rates as well as electricity revenues, we see that they were moderately affected, but the worst affected ones were water, sanitation, and refuse removal. You can see that across all the graphs, all the revenue streams were affected, but more on the water, sanitation, and refuse removal revenue streams. So then we move to the next slide, which
Sorry, Mkululi, you went on mute.
Yeah. You must unmute.
Sorry, I don't know where I muted myself.
I think it was just as you started with this particular slide on municipal and consumer debt.
Oh, thank you, and I don't know how. Yeah, sorry for that. And we looked at municipal consumer debt and how the COVID affected that. What we see in this particular slide is that due to a number of measures like relaxation of credit control regulations, a number of consumers were defaulting on their municipal debt. And as a result, many municipalities couldn't service their debt. We see that in those two diagrams whereby debt to ESCOM, what municipalities owed to ESCOM and water boards. The number of municipalities which were defaulting on their ESCOM and water board accounts increased tremendously. You can see that in those two graphs. And the result of that was really that due to COVID, consumers or households largely couldn't pay their debt and municipalities were failing to service their debt. So is, in a nutshell, consumer debt actually, or what municipalities were owing actually increased as a result of COVID. Next slide. Then, as a way of concluding this particular slide, the Commission is noting the following three aspects: that in the local government sector, there is a need to promote local economic growth. And this can be done in many ways. There is a need for municipalities to reflect on their economies, reflect on their regulations, especially those regulations which hinder economic activities. There is need to streamline red tape, reduce timeframes for getting permits or licenses, and reducing the compliance burden of their regulations. What the Commission is basically saying, there is a need for municipalities to move away from the status quo and really look at other measures that could improve or make their spaces conducive for investment. The other aspect we are looking at is that there is need for revenue enhancement, continuing from our previous submission where the Commission outlined a number of alternative revenue streams. We are saying here there is a need for municipalities to diversify their revenue mix and look into alternative revenues. We have seen that those municipalities which had a diversified revenue base were quick to rebound after the COVID shock. So it's necessary for municipalities to diversify their revenue mix. Then also there is need for municipalities to embrace e-government. We have seen that this improves their efficiency and it improves their financial resilience, especially the digitizing of. There's need for municipalities to digitize municipal administration and payment systems. This will actually improve their efficiencies, and we have seen that automation and online platforms can also improve efficiency. In terms of recommendations from this particular chapter, I'll touch on a few recommendations. We are saying municipalities should undertake a detailed and unbiased analysis of the service they provide and ensure that what they actually do corresponds with their financial capabilities. National and provincial treasuries and COGTA and even SALGA should ensure that municipal organograms, staffing levels, and the compensation of employees are set at levels that do not crowd out service delivery. And also, these actors or players must ensure that municipal budgets are credible and based on realistic revenue collection rates. Secondly, we are saying municipalities should stimulate local economic growth by creating investment-friendly conditions and streamlining those regulations that impede investments within their jurisdiction. And also, municipalities should consider additional or alternative or supplementary revenues, and especially looking at some of their redundant assets. And lastly, National Treasury, through the Municipal Systems Improvement Grant, should support municipalities to embrace e-government or digitization and diversify their revenue mix. That's very important, that there is need for a program that supports municipalities to embrace e-government, which will actually enhance the sector's efficiency. Then next slide, we look at another important issue, the issue of gender responsive budgeting. This continues on what we did some 4 or so years ago, whereby we are looking at whether budgets in the public sector are gender responsive. We know that the government has actually committed itself to gender equality in all spheres. And also we know that women continue to bear a disproportionate burden of the triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So despite these commitments, we see that gender inequality remains very high in the country. And so one instrument which can actually alleviate or minimize gender inequality or eliminate gender inequalities is the budget, the so-called gender responsive budgets. So that's what we are asking in this chapter, whether budgets in the public sector are gender responsive. To assist us do that, we had some case studies of 5 departments: the Department of Basic Education, Department of Health, Department of Social Development, Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, and Department of Justice, as well as the constitutional institution, which is the Gender Commission for Gender Equality, which is responsible, which really looks at gender inequality. So we looked at these departments and this institution to see whether their budgets are gender sensitive. And I will, next slide. I'll skip all these slides. Can you go to slide 40, where I'll summarize the results from these key departments, what we found from these departments. Slide 40, next slide. That slide is just a summary of our findings from these 5 departments plus the Commission for Gender Equality. What we found in all these departments, when we assessed their budgets or the budgeting value chain, whether it is gender responsive, we found that there is limited mainstreaming of gender issues. So we looked at the budgeting process, and from planning up to monitoring and evaluation, we found that there is limited mainstreaming of gender issues. And the main reason for this is that departments generally lack gender disaggregated data and information to enable them to implement gender responsive planning, gender responsive budgeting, monitoring and evaluation, even auditing of their budgets for gender issues. So data is very, very important, but it is lacking across many departments, and therefore gender responsive budgeting is difficult, if not impossible, to undertake without adequate gender disaggregated information. So that's the first point. The second point is that there is limited gender disaggregated data. We noted that gender disaggregated information may be available in other domains, for example, from Statistics South Africa, from the Commission for Gender Inequality. but departments are not integrating that information into their strategic documents. That's one weakness. For instance, that's South Africa and the Commission for Gender Equality. They generate a lot of reports with gender disaggregated data, but that information is not integrated into the various departments' strategic documents. So there is a need to integrate such information into departmental plans, departmental strategies, which is not the case now. Next slide. Our other finding is that we find that departments have performance indicators, various performance indicators, but looking closely at these performance indicators, you find that they are not gender disaggregated. They not tell us how many women benefited from this particular program. And so that's very, very important to have performance indicators from departments to be gender disaggregated. And we noted that there is a need for the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, which is at the heart of coordinating gender equality, to ensure that the indicators, performance indicators within departments are really show or talk to women, and they are also clear and make women to be visible in the strategic documents of departments. Then, fourthly, we also looked at the legislative policy and institutional framework around gender responsive budgeting. What we noted there is gender equality and women's empowerment are often an afterthought or relegated to a sector or specific outcome rather than an integral component across all government sectors. Oversight on gender equality and women empowerment also tends to be limited to the Portfolio Committee on Women, Youth, and Persons with Disabilities. Yet it is a cross-cutting issue which must be found in all committees of Parliament or provinces. And also, we noted that the Commission for Gender Equality which is mandated to promote gender equality and advance the protection, development, and attainment of gender equality. Really, when we looked at their budget, that particular commission, its budget is mainly consumed by compensation of employees, which tends to crowd out areas or other areas which could actually deal with women's empowerment issues. Next slide. In terms of recommendations, we have a couple of recommendations. First, we say the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability and Department of Monitoring and Evaluation should finalize the institutionalization of gender responsive planning throughout national and provincial government as envisaged by the Gender Responsive Planning, Budgeting, Monitoring, Evaluation, and Auditing Framework. So National Treasury, together with Department of Women and Monitoring and Evaluation, should spearhead the implementation of GRB and mainstreaming GRB throughout the entire scope of the budget process. And also, National Treasury should create an enabling environment to institutionalize gender responsive planning, budgeting, monitoring, evaluation, and auditing across departments, across provinces, and even in the local government sphere. Next slide. Also important to the Commission is that National Treasury and Department of Women should consider the introduction of a formal gender auditing process. It's important that there is need for a gender auditing process to ensure that budgets of departments and provinces and local government are gender sensitive. And also the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability should coordinate and spearhead initiatives focused on building capacity, especially at political level and administrative leadership levels on gender responsive budgeting. We have seen that capacity is very weak in these areas to do oversight on gender responsive budgeting and also to monitor budgets from a gendered lens. Also, the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability should, on an annual basis, prepare a comprehensive report on how the division of revenue responds to gender inequality, which is very important for monitoring budgets for gender sensitivity, that each particular year when there's a division of revenue, the Department of Women should come up with a dossier or a report which outlines how that particular budget responds to gender inequality. And also, lastly, the issue of information, gender disaggregated information. We note that the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability, together with Stats South Africa, should provide explicit guidelines for collecting and integrating gender disaggregated data in budgets so that the women and girls are visible within our budgets. Then the next slide, Chen will actually take us through chapter 6, then I'll come again in chapter 7 and 8. Thank you.
Thanks. Apologies, Honourable Chair members, for the little bit of tennis match here. But let me take this one on the testing the means test. And of course, this is quite a controversial issue at the moment in relation to the potential or basic income grants issue. So, we look at this, therefore the Commission has looked at the social assistance in South Africa and also running up to the COVID-19 pandemic. So to any extent, so almost all our sort of social grants in the country currently rely on a relatively simple means test as a targeting mechanism to determine eligibility. To an extent, the negative impacts of COVID-19 has necessitated a reconsideration of poverty and vulnerability, as previously non-poor South Africans experienced severe income shocks or a permanent loss of livelihoods. It is thus important to understand how well the existing grant system covers these vulnerable South Africans, old and new, right? And whether the current means test approach ensures that the poorest receive grants with no significant leakages to those who are ineligible. Furthermore, it is important to understand how the grant system was temporarily adjusted to reach those impacted by the pandemic, as well as how well targeted this effort has been. The slide thus shows the coverage among job losers using the coronavirus rapid mobile surveys of the NIDS, National Income Dynamics Surveys, and suggests some key findings. First, the grant system is progressive, right, as before and now. Second, the possibility of exclusion of poor individuals is relatively low, as you can see there, that especially around the lower income quintiles, it covers quite well. Third, 80% of those who lost their jobs in 2020 lived in a household where some form of social assistance was received, and thus an alternative targeting mechanism may not be needed. Hence, the Commission recommends from the research here that the efficacy of the social grant system continues to be monitored. On eligibility, find out reasons for inadvertent exclusion of eligible grant recipients. And third, one could consider an asset-based of means testing as opposed to just income-based at the moment to minimize leakages. And fourth, on the basic income grants, we'll definitely have to, the government will have to consider its fiscal and socio-economic implications, not just in the short, medium, but actually the long term. I would even say intergenerational implications. Thanks. Next, back to you, Mkhululi.
Thank you, Chen. I'll take members through chapter 7 and 8. Chapter 7 is on the COVID pandemic and food security, the impact of the COVID pandemic on food security, which we, from our research on the impact of COVID, we found the following. Next slide, Chen. We found the following, which there are a few things which I need to highlight there. We know that there were massive job losses as a result of the COVID pandemic, but in terms of food security, what were the effects of the pandemic? First, we see that job losses caused an increase of child hunger. Child hunger due to COVID increased by 28 or 29%. The likelihood of households running out of money for food purchase increased by also 29%, and recurrence of household hunger by almost 8%. So that's the impact of the COVID pandemic, that child hunger increased. The likelihood of households running out of money to buy food also increased, and the recurrence of household hunger also increased. What we also note that old age grants and the COVID grant in particular, they proved to be more effective in protecting households against the welfare reversal compared to the child grant. So those two grants, old age grants and COVID-19 grants, were particularly effective in protecting households against food insecurity. The old age grant reduced incidence of household food insecurity by almost 60%, for 59.6%, which is phenomenal. And also, if we put together child grants, old age grants, and COVID-19 grant, these reduced the incidence of households food insecurity by almost 78%, which suggests the need to expand or upscale existing social grant system. So that's the impact of COVID on food security. Child hunger increased, household running out of money increased, and also the recurrence of household hunger. The next slide. So in conclusion, from this particular chapter, we see that the shock to household income resulted in a substantial welfare loss in terms of worsened adult and child food insecurity. Alternative social protection transfers have diverse effects in countering these effects. So grants with the largest scale proved effective in protecting households, as we have seen, child grants, and they were protecting households against the food insecurity shock, but they were not sufficient to fully insulate all households. But grants are very, very important in protecting households against shocks as the pandemic, as we have seen. So in terms of our recommendations, in the next slide, I'll only highlight some 3 recommendations from that. The first one is that the Department of Social Development should involve local governments and non-profit organizations to collect better information on those unmet needs and to deliver improved targeted assistance during pandemic. What is important there is that whatever assistance is provided, it must be well targeted to those deserving. Then another recommendation is that The Department of Social Development should expand social assistance to increase the coverage of vulnerable households. It is important to identify vulnerable households when there is a shock, and the department should expand social assistance to try and target those households. Then, third recommendation, National Treasury should consider fiscal and monetary incentives during COVID-19. Some of these incentives are lifting of value-added tax, duties or other taxes or on food businesses, or extending concession loans or loan guarantees facilities to food companies. It is important to incentivize food companies when there is a shock such as the COVID pandemic. Next slide. The next slide looks at the impact of the COVID pandemic on water and sanitation. We know that water and sanitation services were really needed and are very important during a pandemic of this nature. But on the other side, we know that South Africa is a water scarce country, and so we need to look at this in the context of what was happening. The demand for water, we know that continues to exceed supply, but also the COVID pandemic has changed the water and sanitation supply and demand dynamics. So there is a need to be more efficient within this, for more efficiency within this particular sector. We need to improve demand management of water. We need to look at tariffs within this particular sector. And we also need to look at how we invest our resources in the sector. So this particular chapter assessed the impact of the COVID pandemic on access to water and sanitation. And we looked at the issue of access, both quality, quantity, and reliability of water resources and sanitation. We also looked at the issue of efficiency in the water and sanitation provision. And we looked at the tariffs, whether they are cost reflective or not. And also we looked at how we can incentivize the private sector to play a role in the water provision. Next slide on our findings. Our findings are that the impact of COVID on water, we see that during the COVID pandemic, access to water decreased by 2%. And look at that one, that percentage in the context of water scarcity in the country, that COVID actually reduced access to water, especially to the poor households, by 2%. And access to sanitation was also equally affected. And also there was a lot of inefficiencies during the COVID pandemic, that many municipalities could do more with less. We found a lot of inefficiencies in the provision of water, especially water leakages. We know that there were water leakages even before the COVID pandemic, but during the COVID pandemic, there were also some inefficiencies which we also noticed. And in terms of cost reflectiveness, we see that water tariffs are not cost reflective in many ways. Many water services authorities had tariffs which were not cost reflective. Next slide. And also the other issue we assessed is how can the private sector participate in the water provision? But we are mindful that private sector provision of water can actually lead to an escalation in the water prices. There is a need to balance that. But looking at the water infrastructure value chain, there is a need to bring in the private sector, because we know that there is a funding gap in terms of water infrastructure. So there is need for the private sector to fill that particular gap in a way that doesn't compromise the price of water, especially to poor households. There is a need to explore other funding mechanisms which can bring in the private sector. And also there's a need to improve the credit worthiness of water supply providers so that they could go out there in the market and borrow to fund water infrastructure. There is also a need to explore other financing mechanisms such as blended finance, and also to de-risk potential investment deals and lower transaction costs, especially in order to attract the private sector. So in terms of recommendations from this particular chapter, we have few recommendations. We are saying that municipalities advised by SALCA should approach tariff adjustments cautiously, especially during the COVID pandemic. There is a need to take into account the poor when they set tariffs, so it must be approached cautiously to protect the poor. And also the Department of Water and Sanitation should establish a benchmarking of water service providers' service level agreements and align these to the department's performance indicators in terms of infrastructure, socio-political and financial indicators. And the Minister of Finance should ensure that water and sanitation projects also form part of the economic stimulus to help mitigate the impact of the COVID pandemic. And lastly, the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Water and Sanitation, together with the municipalities, should systematically develop water investments by structuring mechanisms to de-risk private investments. This is to attract private investors into the water provision value chain, and also for long-term sustainability, there is a need to capacitate water service providers and improve governance mechanisms for the water service providers and safeguard all the water provision against corruption, and also improve the ability of the private sector to manage both high-level government demands and possible public opposition. So there's a need to build capacity around water provision, as we have seen in our study that there is some weaknesses in terms of capacity in the provision of water infrastructure. Thank you. And
Okay, Tondo, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mkhululi and Chen. Good morning, Honorable Chairperson and Honorable members. I'll be taking you through the last two chapters of the presentation. So starting with the focus of chapter 9. So this chapter focuses on the system of intergovernmental oversight and support that is provided by national and provincial governments. And what we're looking at is the extent that the system of oversight and monitoring can help to avoid S139 interventions. So I will just briefly unpack the pipeline of the oversight and support system so that members can better appreciate what we're looking at. So it starts with regulations that municipalities need to comply with. It's then followed with an oversight that is conducted by national and provincial governments to ensure compliance and to pick up any challenges that require mitigation and addressing. So based on anything that's picked up during the oversight phase, there is then the support function where whereby any identified challenges are addressed. In cases where these challenges cannot be sorted out, we then move to the final phase, which is intervention by national and national government, by national and provincial governments or provincial governments in the affairs of municipalities via the S139 or the section 139 of the Constitution. So this section 139 intervention generally happen when there is a breakdown in the operations or aspects of service delivery in a municipality. So what the main point that we're emphasizing on this slide is that the persistence of Section 139 intervention raises concern around the effectiveness of the oversight and support framework as to whether it adds any value in terms of acting as an early warning system that allows us to identify municipalities that allows us to identify municipalities the potential threat of intervention in this regard. So next slide. So the next slides we're looking at the findings of this particular chapter. There are 7 of them. I will try and unpack them briefly. So we'll go through each one of them. So the first one is a finding on oversight or supervision. So what we mean there is that the term that you use become important. So the first thing is whether we should view the role played by national and provincial governments in municipalities through the lens of oversight or supervision, because when you use, for instance, the term supervision, it implies that it's a type of relationship with national and provincial spheres acting as a sort of big brother in relation to municipalities. But if you use the term oversight, which is what we prefer, it actually embraces the autonomy of each sphere and requires the cooperation of each sphere in working together. So there is a distinction in which that's very important, in which term you use, whether it's oversight or supervision. That's the first finding. That second finding then relates to the financial support. So in terms of oversight and support framework, the capacity building grants that represent a type of financial support. So the municipal system improvement grant and the financial management grant are 2 key support building programs that we have in the system. So our assessment shows that while these grants provide the much needed funds, they are weakly linked to the overall oversight and support system. The third finding relates to cost and benefits. So there is a general acceptance that the new legislation and regulations have a cost attached to compliance. What is not generally acknowledged is the fact that these costs are associated with complying and monitoring requirements, as well as support initiatives. So, for example, we have legislation that monitors the requirements of Section 1771 reporting. Then you have what we can call as, what we can refer to as ad hoc or non-legislative monitoring requirements. So what we found out was that municipalities spend time, effort and resources in complying, but with little or no benefit that comes from the use of these resources. So moving on to the fourth finding, which is on differentiation, what we note is that the local government sphere has to comply with a significant amount of regulations, as we all know. Some will say the regulations that they have to comply with are even excessive. So our concern is that some of these regulations take a a very uniform approach whereby all municipalities, irrespective of their financial and human capacity, have to comply. So what then this results into is a situation where some municipalities are just unable to comply, and they are therefore continuously penalized for not complying, especially because what we've noted is that the adherence or the compliance is also linked to or is also used as a measure of performance. So in our view, we were saying there should be some recognition of the varying capacity of municipalities. The fifth the finding relates to capacity of provinces. What we note here is that the implementation of the oversight framework differs significantly across provinces. In some provinces, for instance, you find that the efforts are better coordinated and there's a better working relationship between the provincial government and the municipality. So which means that the system of cooperative governance is better applied in certain provinces in relation to other provinces. What then this results into is a relatively stronger oversight framework implementation in some provinces, whereas in some provinces this is not the case. And then the sixth province, I'm sorry, the sixth finding is with regards to evaluation. So what we note here is that there are no regular or periodic evaluations of components of the components that comprise to the oversight and support framework of monitoring. But what the point that we're making is that in order for us to learn and to make adjustment to the program, an approach is needed that's supposed to be taken to conduct monitoring and support and also regular evaluation. So what we are saying is that these regulations and the reviews of performance of these different components, if they are undertaken late, and when much time and money has been spent. So what we need there is a more proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. The last finding is on the legislative prescripts. The fact that government departments act according to their legal mandate. What we found is that some key legislation can be fueling duplication in this instance when it comes to oversight and support framework. For example, if we take the MFA and the Municipal Systems Act, as well as other, if you look at other various legislation within the sector, our assessment of this legislation is that they reveal that there have been significant overlapping, focusing on the same areas. So, for example, they all speak about how to set tariffs. So, or you have municipalities having to comply and various sector departments fulfilling their roles in terms of overseeing what municipalities are doing in regard to the Prescripts Act in question. So those are the findings of this particular chapter. Next slide, please. So the recommendations flowing from this chapter speak to these findings that we've just outlined. So firstly, I'll try and summarize the findings. So firstly, we recognize and support the review of the capacity building grants that have been undertaken by the National Treasury. We further advise that as part of the review consideration should be given to directing the two key financial management capacity building grants, and they should be directed disproportionately towards lesser resourced and more rural municipalities who's struggling when it comes to resources to put in place for financial management system. So we call upon the Minister of Corporate Governance to implement mechanisms to ensure that evaluations of the impact of the entire oversight and support framework is undertaken. So we recommend that particular emphasis be placed on the cost-benefit analysis when new regulations and monitoring support initiatives are introduced. Next slide, please. So further than in relation to this cost benefit analysis that we do not only we recommend that we do not focus on the extent to which the oversight and support framework results in improved performance, such as, for example, an increase in the number of funded budgets. But as such, assessments must also focus on the extent to which the oversight and support framework is efficient and effective in terms of the burden that it places on municipalities. So we also recommend that government should reconsider the current uniform approach that is being used to implement the oversight and support framework, and that a differentiated approach that recognizes the varying capacity of municipalities be considered when requiring compliance and regulatory and oversight or reporting requirements. Carrying out of the oversight and support system also places a burden on provinces. So to this end, we recommend that the Minister of Finance ensure that provincial treasuries are capacitated to undertake their oversight and support role. And then finally, we recommend that the legislation that gives rise to duplication within the oversight and support framework be reviewed. Next slide. So the last chapter then it focuses on the issue of leadership and governance issues when it comes to infrastructure projects. So in terms of the focus of the chapter, we start by recognizing the fact that the success or failure of government with respect to infrastructure and service delivery it depends largely on leadership and leadership styles that are used. So in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, leadership plays a vital role as key decisions need to be taken in order to respond quickly, efficiently, effectively, and economically at all spheres of government. So this chapter then analyzes various interrelated factors, including public leadership, governance, and accountability. But in as far as it relates to the implementation of infrastructure projects. So what we looked at here are two case studies relating to the housing catalytic projects. So one was the Duncan Village in the Eastern Cape, and the other one was in the Great Columbia project in KZN. So we conducted interviews with regards to both of these projects, but we also looked at the Guyana bulk water project, where we relied heavily on secondary data. But the reason we included that is because we found the secondary data to be useful in terms of the insight that it provided. So in terms of our findings, the findings from the case studies revealed that lack of dedicated and adequate funding, lack of intergovernmental coordination, political interference, and poor political leadership, and the absence of policies and regulation, supply chain irregularities, project delays, and an escalation of project costs. With respect to Guyana bulk water project, well, our main finding related to leadership and governance challenges that included poor leadership and interference, as well as failure to comply with supply chain regulations, which resulted in delays in project implementation. So in terms of the finding that emanated from the Auditor General report, we noted that there is an increasing real value of irregular expenditure in audit outcomes of the Department of Human Settlement and Water and Sanitation. And the period that we're looking at was 2014-15 to 2018-19. And it confirmed that little or no effort were made to implement the recommendation of the Auditor General as indicated in that graph. So that graph shows that when you look at irregular expenditure, it has been increasing over the years. For instance, it increased from 1.8 billion in 2015-16 to 3.1 billion in 2018 and 19. So clearly there has been this increase in irregular expenditure. Next slide. So in terms of the recommendations then for this chapter, there are three main recommendations that we make. The first one, we're saying that the Minister for Finance in the Division of Revenue should ensure that commitment to compliance with regulations and policy framework is formalized in all participants, especially when it comes to infrastructure projects. And we're saying this should be before the commencement of the project with financial consequences for compliance failures that are clearly set, that should be clearly set out. And then the Minister of Corporate Governance and Regional Affairs should review the intergovernmental coordination policy framework and consider strengthening intergovernmental coordination both vertically and horizontally. This emanates from the fact that the intergovernment arrangement clearly defines how the three spheres of government should work together, especially in the implementation of a number of mandates, including infrastructure as well. But what we found is that it is silent on how coordination should be done between these spheres. And then the last recommendation was saying the Minister of Finance in the Division of Revenue should incentivize consequence management so that all public office bearers are held legally and personally responsible when they transgress supply chain management policies in the implementation of infrastructure project. Chairperson, that's the end of the presentation, and I will hand over to Commissioner Rockman. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think, Chairperson, let us hand over to you so that we engage on the presentation. Thank you very much.
Chairperson, you are muted. Chairperson? So can everybody else hear the chairperson?
Hi, Member Mackenzie. I cannot hear the chairperson.
Let's try a cell phone quickly.
Labor matters, drawing up a whip, zero protection, uncontested, basic context. You will need a good lawyer.
Are you able to call?
I'm just trying a cell phone now.
The chair says that she can hear us, but we cannot hear her. So I'm just going to ask her to log off and log in again.
Thank you, Asima.
She's still muted. I can see the button is still muted, so she might just unmute herself.
Yeah, she said that it doesn't want to unmute.
So she can hear us. She can just log in and log out again.
Okay, she's just going to log in and log out, and then she'll can just give her a moment.
Hi, is everyone able to hear me now?
We can hear you now, thanks.
Thank goodness. Thank you for that. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for the presentation. And we will then now take a round of hands. I see Member Mackenzie's hand is up. Any other hands for questions? Okay, Member Mackenzie, you may go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. And as always, I think we mentioned it yesterday, Chairperson, we always appreciate the work that the FFC does. It's always in-depth and great quality research. And I know that you've also said that you're going to write to them to see how they do their research so that we can benefit from the expertise. I've read the recommendations and it almost feels like it's deja vu, obviously different case studies. And I've asked this previously when the late professor was here, who's not with us anymore, and may his soul rest in peace. Does Treasury, and some of the recommendations is to intergovernmental relations, Treasury, Department of Water and Sanitations, do they actually take these recommendations into account and do they implement them? One of them particularly, if for example, the Guyana project, and we know it's been coming for years and years and years. And based on my readings, there hasn't been a sense of accountability of people that were involved in particularly that project and people who interfered in that project, whether it's politicians or whether it's administrators. All the great work that you do, where does it go? Because it doesn't seem like the recommendations based on face value has been taken into account. And if the FFC can just share with us what the recommendations has been implemented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Member Mvimbi.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Maybe my question might be just similar to what Honorable Mackenzie has raised, but in a different way, especially when it comes to the chapter that deals with local government. I just want to check whether as the Commission at any given point maybe begin also to present this report to local government as maybe specifically to specific municipality, or do they just present it to SALGA and maybe do they even engage it with it? Because I think as I look at it, when especially on the section that deals with local government, it will be really more beneficial to local government in most of the things. And I must say, I appreciate the in-depth analysis they've done when it comes to issues of local government. And I think they also acknowledge that the local government, when it comes to local economy, local government, so that regard that I want to check whether have they really had an opportunity to engage with it, either SALGA, specific municipalities, or just local government in general. Also related to that, Chairperson, when it comes to intergovernmental relations, I once again, focus seems to have been on Section 139, on which is again intervention of provincial government to issues of local government. And now I just want to check, does the Commission at some point maybe also look into Section 100, which is the intervention of the national government to provincial government? Have they had any instances where or maybe can they relate to us as to maybe in this pandemic, how has provincial government fared, and also what has been the responsibility of provincial governments in general towards assisting local municipalities at local level, without having to actually make use of Section 19, just in a intergovernmental relations way. Yeah, I just also, when it comes to issues of gender, the chapter that deals with gender. I know most of the time when it comes to gender, there's always been either female or male, but what is the Commission's attitude or view on the issues of LGBTI issues? How do they actually relate to that, and where do they locate them? Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you so much, Member Mvimbi. Member Nkondlo.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the very extensive presentation by FFC. Maybe to start with the last, with what Honorable Mvimbi has just raised. I think few months ago, the chairperson of the NCOP, in an engagement with SALCA, actually raised a alarm with what Member Mvimbi is raising about how the intervention of provinces to municipalities and putting them under administration at most has not yielded the positive results, but is seen as actually trying to take over and sometimes politicized. I'm not sure whether the FFC has done any studies or research, and if they do have any findings about indeed across the country what has been some of the results of those kind of municipalities post the administration by provinces, whether that does help in terms of improving the financial situations of these municipalities. And then moving from that one, Chair, I think for me, this issue of the gender responsive budget, I think continues to be an elusive issue in our country. Yes, policy-wise, institutional-wise, we've raised issues of gender. But indeed, I think the report or the presentation also still continues to indicate that we are not where we're supposed with all the great policy decisions or choices that we have made. And for me, one asks the question that if we look at whatever that is happening, is there a move? Even with COVID, I mean, we're sitting almost 2 years now into the COVID-19, is indeed when the FFC looks and the recommendations that we have been making, and I'm raising this with gender, but broadly speaking, since 2019, the type of submissions that FFC has made, are they observing any departure from our national government in terms of how fiscal is managed, in response to some of the proposals being made, including the one you're raising about localized production, localized economy, because on one hand, we are sitting with local procurement or localization or local content policy, but indeed we're still having serious challenges in terms of that as an ideal and the actual implementation thereof, where you would find, the old argument from a procurement point of view of how we do this as a state without considering the premium that we pay and competitiveness, which obviously would be our challenge where we're sitting as a country if we look at our current economic structure. So I think my biggest question, both in terms of GRB, that is the gender responsive budget, because I remember, Chair, as we're discussing it in the budget workshop, that even at this point, the last time I think we called it the Gender Commission and Treasury, we're still being told that this is still a discussion, it is not being implemented. And I think the presentation confirms such in this regard. So at what point, or what do we do, what should we be doing, to try and move things beyond the ideas, beyond the findings that are being made to the actual, because we are really under a serious ticking time bomb. The other one is on this public sector. I think in one of the slides it mentions, I think what is recommended to try and deal with the current bloated public sector wage bill that we're having. especially now we're even sitting with the current crisis, of the negotiation between public sector and between DPSA and the public sector unions. So for me, I'm asking that the type of proposals being placed by FFC at this point are these things that you are starting to see being even compacted in terms of the KPIs of the very DGs to realize this shift that we require. Because I think it becomes very frustrating that we are seeing and we are analyzing, we are putting up suggestions of what needs to happen in our country to reorientate our economy so that we realize that sustained and inclusive growth. But it seems we are very slow in terms of realizing such. My last one, Chair, is on the intergovernmental and on infrastructure and the irregular expenditure raised there. I think I'm always interested in this thing, is whether is it still making sense? Is it justifiable to still be speaking about infrastructure-led growth whilst we have all of these leakages in as far as an ecosystem to realize the promise of this infrastructure-led growth? Because I think this is one area that we keep on, I think president after president focus on infrastructure-led growth. But I think if one looks at the ecosystem, because if you look at the irregular expenditure, even the one that is mentioned on human settlement from as early as around 2014, if I saw correctly from that graph, that there are fiscal leakages on huge amounts of billions that are placed in the infrastructure-led growth, which is supposedly to realize job opportunities, to realize skills development, and the other things that we need as the economy. And time year in and year out, we're still finding ourselves on the other side in terms of output and outcome, that we've got increasing unemployment, increasing levels of lack of skills, whilst the amount in terms of investment, including the one that we go out there, that is international investors put in as far as infrastructure projects. That is why I'm asking the question, is indeed justifiable just to a layman and a lay person like myself to still be talking about this infrastructure-led growth if indeed the ecosystem has got all of these leakages, which actually makes it that the rent that is actually put in this kind of infrastructure projects, does not realize, the type of benefit also from a rent value, but also the other developmental objectives that or economic benefits that the country would have actually placed on that infrastructure projects. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you so much. Ms. Ishmael, do you have a question for the FFC?
Chair, sorry, I have one more question after that.
Okay, no problem. Ms. Ishmael, you have a hand up.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you. I think that was a very, very insightful presentation, and I put my hand up actually just to congratulate the Commission for such an insightful presentation. I, in particular, focus on two chapters, and especially from a Department of the Premier perspective. And I welcome Chapter 3. The commentary on the alignment and effectiveness of performance indicators per se, consistency and coherence of the KPIs, and only measuring progress. Suffice to say that I think it would be very welcoming to engage the FCC further on the value of performance data. It is something that we're also very much focusing on. And to share our service delivery indicator publication definitely with the FCC. And then secondly, it is the Chapter 5 and the concluding remarks, in particular, what instruments and what tools are we using? So over the years, progressively, Western Cape government have very much tried to, I would say, spice up, for a lack of a better word, the technical indicator descriptions in an annual performance plan. And if one look at that and one look and you actually compare how the indicator development have taken place, there is a full indicator landscape. And we as Western Cape government are now starting to show how those indicators speak to gender, youth, disability, the elderly. So, and very much you are spot on in terms of the evaluations. While we have done historically a number of evaluations across since 2011, we've actually done more evaluations than Africa in itself. Within the context of the national evaluation system, impact evaluation and cost benefit analysis are the most expensive. So there's not so many of that have been done. So thank you for that, and looking forward to engage further. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So FFC, you've heard directly from Ms. Ishmael. She wants to have coffee and chat to you about indicators and KPIs and performance. Member Mackenzie?
Thank you, Chair. Just one more question that I forgot to ask. Does the FFC have a tracker system on recommendation made 2 or 3 years ago to various entities, whether provinces, SALGAs, or government, to see which recommendations they implemented and which ones not? Thank you.
Thank you. I have one question, so I'm just going to throw mine in here as well. To the FFC, you spoke about consequence management, and I was thinking, have you considered suggesting to the national government, I'm not sure to which department, perhaps to the Justice Department, that it legislate the ancient Roman common law principle of qui tam? And our system currently is based on Roman and common law and Roman Dutch common law. And qui tam, I know, is an abbreviation for the original principle, which was something like qui tam pro domino something something. And it essentially means he who sues in the matter for the king as well as for himself. And I know it's still a common law principle in South Africa, because I know the Competition Commission also has it within its regime. So there is precedence for it, and it was never outlawed in South Africa and repealed in any of our statutes. And essentially what it does, it allows people on the street, whoever you are, private citizen, an organization, an NGO, where that person or someone or an organization picks up fraud or fruitless and wasteful expenditure, or something that's like fraud, something where there's fault, then they are able to essentially sue on behalf of government and on behalf of the public. And then what happens is you get, in some jurisdictions like the US, for example, they give the government an opportunity to join the application. So they seal the application with essentially the whistleblower's names and details until government has an ability to assess whether or not they want to join the application. And if they don't join, if government does not join the application, then the whistleblower person has the option of unsealing the application and going forth with the court case on behalf of the public in order to recuperate the funds that were stolen, essentially by persons. There is precedence in the South African law for it, and there is precedence in other jurisdictions that are similar to South Africa and our current common law system. And I just wanted to find out if the FFC has ever considered making such a recommendation. I know if a recommendation like that is implemented, it might not necessarily be exactly the same as other jurisdictions, but given that it has never been repealed on our statute books, it might be worthwhile to revisit the Roman principle of qui tam. Thank you. Ms. Rockman, I'm not sure who will be answering everything, or if you're going to be just assisting with assigning the questions for answering. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you, members, for the questions. It's almost like the Honourable Member Mackenzie has been sitting in the FFC meetings when he asks about the tracker system for recommendations. In our most recent meeting on 15 July, we were dealing with exactly the same issue, where we are beginning to just review and update what the tracking systems we have, what is in place. There is a whole new project in the FFC to redevelop and improve our digitalization to make it easier, because when you start dealing with recommendations of 10, 15 and 20 years ago, it becomes complicated. So we are working now on breaking down into thematic areas so that it becomes easier to track and see what was the recommendation, has it been implemented or not, has the environment changed if it was not implemented, that it is worth re-looking at, what is the impact if it has been implemented. So it's a very dynamic environment and subject we are now dealing with. Every year we get these questions from every legislature. Does National Treasury or government take the FFC recommendations seriously? There's a couple of dimensions to it. There is a agreement between FFC and National Treasury that dates back to some time ago, some years ago, that basically says National Treasury responds to the issues that directly affect division of revenue. But if we make other recommendations that does not directly affect division of revenue or fiscal matters that falls directly in the scope and mandate of National Treasury, they would refer those recommendations to other departments. I don't think we have been strong enough in following up those other recommendations, the responses and impact and feedback and so forth. So that's an area of work that we are now looking at. But we've also realized that we need to relook at the way we formulate recommendations. You will notice this year we've attempted to bring in much more specific recommendations to say we recommend the Minister of Finance does X, Y, and Z, or the Minister of COCTA, or the Minister of this, that, or the other, so that it doesn't just fall through the cracks, that it's a vague recommendation that doesn't get assigned to someone specifically. On local government, the Party Institute has produced an excellent report on the effectiveness of Section 139 investigations. And I think we can share with the committee certainly that study. When we started the topic, we wanted to look at that aspect of effectiveness of Section 139. And after going through the Party study, it was clear that we would not be able to add more value than what is already there. That is why we changed our angle from how do you prevent the 139 interventions. I think the comments to say that the traditional 139 interventions, specifically those with an administrator model, has really not achieved the impact that it was intended to do. You will notice there's a pattern of recurring 139 interventions in some municipalities, which clearly means that it is not sustainable. And with the question on how do we engage with local government, I think primarily we've engaged with SALGA, but we have acknowledged that there is a gap and we need to engage broadly with either at least the metros or secondary cities, some rural municipalities. So it's something new that we will be unpacking and see how do we extend the reach of the Commission in these matters. The gender paper, I think, was a very interesting and unique paper in the sense that it's an area that we have not looked at before. And I think is it Ms. Ishmael from Premier's office? You are quite correct. The lack of consistency and quality of performance indicators, our inability as government departments to produce gender disaggregated data and use that gender disaggregated data is a area that we really need to improve. Stats SA and the Commission on Gender Equality produces gender disaggregated data, but we don't even use that information and we don't properly integrate that information in our planning systems. I think we highlight that the new proposed framework on gender responsive budgeting, monitoring, planning and evaluation has been under consideration since 2018. And there's not enough momentum to get to finality with these matters. So it's something that we are highlighting to say we really need to prioritize and focus on this area, because we've largely lost a lot of momentum that we had in the early years. I think we will also be engaging with the Commission on Gender Equality. They produce excellent work and excellent research reports. So we also need to further engage with them and see how do we collaborate to move the gender debate forward. I don't think, but the researchers might correct me, I don't think we have done work in the LGBTQI aspects. It might be something that we will be looking at in future. But our focus was, and I was really the one who was pushing this to say, do not dilute the gender narrative and the gender perspective by bringing in youth, children, people with disabilities. We tend to dilute the gender narrative. And it's something we should be very conscious of not doing if we want to achieve what we set out to do to reach gender equity and equality. On consequence management, I think we are acknowledging that the Public Audit Amendment Act is a very important initiative. And I think we have begun to see in the latest audit cycle where the Auditor General is now citing the material irregularities. He sets out very clearly the steps that need to be taken, and the consequences is very clear. It is unfortunate it has had to reach this stage that consequence management was not consistently taken and implemented effectively in the past. This aspect is a new aspect that the Honourable Chairperson has raised. I'm not sure whether we have considered that. Mostly we would make recommendations according to our research topics. I don't think we have made specific recommendations that affects the justice and constitutional development sector. It's something that we should be able to look at. I think let me give Dr. Ngobi and Mr. Chen and the other presenters also opportunity to respond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thanks, Commissioner. Thanks, and Honourable Chair members for the questions. So I think Commissioner Rockman has already covered most of it. If I may just add on one question by two. One by Honourable Kondlo regarding should we continue with this infrastructure-led growth? I think we must, because in the literature and also within the economic theory, the job of the government is to provide that public investments and to bring about public infrastructure, the public good, the stuff that nobody else wants to, put down their money in, and so it's a must. However, there is the efficiency issue, whereby the question is, we put down public investments, how much of that then turns into, real growth or economic returns and public capital for growth. And this is where I think over the past decades, that government has somewhat fallen outside of, because do you remember that over the many years that we focus a lot about on like the differentiation between social infrastructure versus economic infrastructure, but at the end of the day, we are where we are now. So one has to perhaps rethink and just to think a little bit deeper and more strategically as to which type and what type of infrastructure that as governments we invest in, and also what have been the empirical, the real returns on those investments, and then how one then decide forward as to where we should be focusing our attention in. And then the other question regarding, by Honourable Chair, regarding consequence management. I think Commissioner Rogman has said it all regarding the material irregularity that AG is now being given the baton to exercise its rights and power and authority. I think the other part, though, that I'd like to bring in is that PFMA has never been used, strange enough, to prosecute anyone, even though inside the PFMA, especially around, I think, Section 80 or something, that there is saying that should, whether it be negligent or willful or otherwise, mistakes and irregularities, wasteful and fruitless, wasteful nature of spending, that person must go to jail. And but that has never been used. So that is perhaps also a little gap, well, big gap, whereby in the consequence management and as per the legislation, and that we now having to come up with more, surrounding. Now we have SIU, we have this we have the AG's power, and then it just seems a very repetitive, duplicative, and wasteful in itself, some sense. Thank you, Chair. Let me give to Kululi to answer the local government questions.
Thank you. I think Commissioner Rockman has responded to most of the local government issues. I'll simply underscore two issues, especially the issue about our recommendations being taken seriously, which was raised by Honorable Mackenzie, as well as, in a way, Honorable Nkondlo. What about our recommendations? There are two sides to this argument, whether our recommendations are being taken seriously. We have seen that government sometimes implements our recommendations after some time. It takes time for the wheels of government to change and obviously to respond to some of our recommendations. Initially, government will have a dialogue with FFC, accept some of our recommendations and reject some of our recommendations, and that is expected. Then for those recommendations which are accepted, FFC cannot enforce the implementation of those, but it is incumbent upon Parliament to make sure that those recommendations which are enforced are implemented. So the issue really comes back to Parliament that for those recommendations which are implemented, they have to call these particular departments and find out from them whether are they implementing what they accepted from FFC. So, but some of them we find they implement them after some time. For example, we are talking about the gender paper. Last week, there was a meeting whereby stakeholders led by National Treasury and even bringing in the IMF, the debate was about the gender responsive budgeting. And from that meeting, a roadmap was actually done to implement gender responsive budgeting within government. So there is some movement. And if you think of it, we started recommending gender responsive budgeting some 4 years ago, and also in this particular submission. So government is actually taking that one seriously. It's another example. If we also look at 2 years ago, we recommended some alternative revenue sources in the local government sector. We are happy to note that government has responded to, and they are now coming up with some legislation on development charges, which we recommended some 2 years ago. So those are some of the examples that the wheels of government take time, but when they are accepted, they sometimes implement some of our recommendations. But we also call upon Parliament to ensure that some of these recommendations that are accepted are really implemented. Then the other issue, I would like to underscore what Commissioner Rockman has said on interventions. We have seen a number of interventions failing, and there are very few success stories about Section 139 interventions. And I think everyone in the IGFR fraternity has actually noted that there is something wrong with our interventions, especially this administrator model whereby you throw in an administrator in a council which is intact and hope for miracles for that administrator to come up with miracles. We have seen that it has not worked. I think there is a process to review this particular intervention and sensitize all stakeholders about the weaknesses of that and how it should be done. I think National Treasury is leading that particular process. And also, in some of these interventions, you find that the intervener who is supposed to correct what is wrong has no capacity. So I think they are looking into even provinces, the capacity of provinces to intervene. Do they have capacity to do that? So the whole process of intervention must be looked at holistically. I think parties in the IGFR fraternity are actually looking into that. So I think those are my responses, just to underscore what Commissioner Rockman has said. Thank you.
Thank you. Are those all the responses from persons then? Okay. Colleagues, are there any follow-up questions? Going once, going twice. Okay. Thank you so much then to the FFC for joining us today. It's always wonderful having you in committee and to participate in engaging in quite comprehensive research that you always do. And I will definitely ask that the members take what you have said for the 2022-2023 DORA in consideration. And perhaps even for the respective chairs to receive your documentation as well for their own consideration for committees as well. But with that, I will now allow you to go about your day-to-day activities and leave the meeting. I am going to ask that we just take a quick 5-minute comfort break and that we reconvene at 11 for the next presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jay.
No, I know you won't babysit you at all. I mean, you wouldn't just be elected there.
Welcome back, everyone. It is 11:02, and we are now reconvening the meeting. I would like to thus invite the Provincial Treasury and the Department of the Premier that's going to present the fourth quarter report to us. If I could just have an indication of who will be taking the lead for us. I know, I think it's Miss Pick that is acting HOD today. No, sorry, where's my phone? Someone messaged me there's an acting HOD today. Miss Cantana.
Miss Cantana, yes.
She's acting HOD today. Perfect. Thank you, Miss Pick. You can just indicate who will be doing the presentation for us. You can just introduce the delegation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. As indicated, Ms. Cantana is the acting HOD for today. I will be leading in terms of from the Treasury perspective on the presentation, and then Ms. Ishmael will lead from the Department of the Premier on the presentation. So, Chair, if it's possible for the presentation to be flighted. Otherwise, I can. There we go. In terms of, and if we could just have the slide on. And so while it's been flighted, Chair, then I'll also indicate to you. Yes, yes. While it's being flighted, I just also want to indicate in terms of who we have present, Chair. We do have in terms of an integrated delegation within the Provincial Treasury. We have infrastructure representative, as well as in terms of our governance side of the Treasury that is represented, and then obviously in terms of a full budget team.
The presentation mode is at the bottom of the screen on the orange section there, close to usually where the time and date is. It kind of looks like a bit of a liberty sign that holds up something. No, try.
Next. There we go. That one. Yes. Go. All right, thank you so much. So we'll just pause on the first slide in terms of the presentation, and this is the presentation of the fourth quarter, which then also culminates into the aggregate spending for and preliminary spending for the and outcomes on the budget performance for the entire financial year, which is the 2020-2021 financial year. And I just want to pause here on the slide for us just to take a reflection in terms of what this year and what these numbers and also the outcomes on the targets really represent. And so if you could just hold that slide there, is indicating in terms of our context. And our context is in terms of from really the 26th of March 2020 is when we already was responding with our first circular that we issued as a Treasury to the pandemic. And then that in terms of escalated in terms of the disaster, state of disaster that was also then indicated at the national level. And then our first objective then from the 1st of April of 2020, a few weeks, 2 weeks to be exact, after we've tabled the 2021 budget, was a full reprioritization of this budget towards our frontline services to respond to the pandemic. So overall for this year that we are going to be talking about, if we remember that we have passed, we have passed three adjustment budgets. We have in our first adjustments budget, which happened, we tabled on this very same day as today, the 23rd of July, 2020, we tabled our first adjustment budget to respond to COVID. as well as in terms of this year also represented in terms of the first response in terms of fiscal consolidation, and then preparing the entire government system for a further fiscal consolidation at levels that we have not seen before. And so that culminated in terms of, from a financial perspective, of what departments have faced. But on the ground, in terms of what departments have faced, is in terms of, number one, in March, the end of March, is implementing their business continuity plans in terms of a disaster, and then also making sure that they can be up and running eventually in terms of service delivery. This is now the frontline services. And then in terms of also then responding appropriately and reprioritizing their service delivery model in terms of responding to the pandemic. Then lastly, in terms of actual implementation, what this year then actually meant in terms of assisting our frontline services to respond to the pandemic, included in terms of unlocking value for money through good governance. So some of the let's say groundbreaking work that we have introduced in this financial year is in terms of what we call, and perhaps the committee has heard of, a CPAC, which is the Central Procurement Advisory Committee, which is a committee which also consisted of internal audit and a delegation of Treasury officials, and that was mainly to guide the emerging emergency and the lockdown of procurement that needed to happen immediately. Furthermore, I think the committee is also aware that for the very first time, we also then published the procurement disclosure report, also known as the PDR. So I think that setting, it has been a year of change, continuous change. It has been a year of unknown until we have gathered sufficient information and in order to respond and have the evidence in order to make that response that is required and that is sustainable throughout the year. And I think we need to keep that in the back of our minds while we are going through the slides, both from a financial perspective, but also then from the targets that has been achieved by the provincial government. So just overall then, in terms of the overview, our outcome then in terms of on the financial side of department's performance, we've achieved and spent 98.2% of our budget. On an infrastructure side, we have spent 95.5% of our budget. And then on the departmental validated non-financial information, we have been able to achieve 77% of our targets. When we look at the next slide, which then goes into the financial outcome, the next slide. And so the next slide then gives you in terms of where we started out in terms of our main budget, the adjustments, and then also then provides you, it gives you in terms of that is the net adjustments or the accumulation of all three adjustments budget that we passed in the financial year. So you'll see that overall the net effect is a reduction of 215 million rand. Our outcome then, as I indicated, was in terms of a 98.2% spend on average, with a total underspending of 1.3 billion rand. I need to indicate that the preliminary expenditure that is being reflected, this has been before in terms of final accounting transactions, journals, as well as in terms of clearing suspense accounts within departments. So some of the numbers has changed in terms of that process within departments, and that will be reflected in terms of the annual financial statements that will be tabled within within the legislature. Then just to indicate to you in terms of where the majority of spending has occurred, that is in the Department of Education, the Department of Health, and then also the Department of Transport and Public Works. Mainly our frontline services that needed to respond to COVID-19 and therefore was obviously also impacted by COVID-19 in terms of business plans that were planned at the beginning of the financial year, but also in terms of how we had to respond to COVID-19. So some of the detail, which is in the next slide. As I indicated, a 98.2% spent of adjustment budget. That amounts to 1.3 billion rand underspending within those three departments, as I previously indicated. Then in terms of on economic classification, the impact then of and where we find that underspending was then in terms of underspending on compensation of employees, as well as goods and services. And this is a trend through most of the departments on compensation of employees. And the main reason for that is in terms of the compensation of employees. Number one, when the beginning of the financial year, when we all went into lockdown, the departments needed to still get up and running, as I indicated, in terms of their business continuity plans, and therefore the planned recruitment process on compensation was halted quite severely. Then also on a compensation of employees, we'll remember that in the second adjustments budget, as part of fiscal consolidation at the National Treasury level, our COE was also reduced substantially in our second adjustments budget, which impacted decision-making on COE, and therefore also then you'll see the trend throughout departments in terms of the impact that it's had in terms of the underspending on planned recruitment. And then also then there was an overspending on transfers and subsidies, and that is mainly in the Department of Education that we will see. Again, I need to reiterate that the overspending that is reflected here, some of it will be offset by year-end entries, as I indicated, by vitamins and then by clearing suspense accounts in some of the departments. Moving along to the next slide. So when we get into detail, some of the detail in terms of the underspending and in the departments in which it occurred, the Department of Health, the net underspending that is indicated is about 361 million rand. And that mainly occurred in terms of goods and services and compensation of employees. This also then some of the journals at that stage and the clearing of suspense accounts within health was not done as such. And so that has been reduced in terms of the audited, the pre-audited financial statements to about 250 million rand once they have cleared the suspense accounts. Just some noting that at this time, and they would have that kind of, they would have about 100 million almost in clearing and suspense accounts, just in terms of where health found themselves at the end of the financial year. And you need to remember that at the end of the financial year, they were just getting out of the second wave. And so therefore the accumulation still in suspense accounts. On the education side, you'll see that the underspending there amounted mainly in terms of goods and services and buildings and fixed structures. And then, as I indicated, an overspending within non-profit institutions transfers, and that is in terms of mainly in terms of schools in 214 million rand. So on the goods and services and the buildings, the impact there in mainly is in terms of because of impact of COVID pandemic that had on the entire education infrastructure system and plans that they had in place. And then on the non-profit institutions, the over expenditure that is indicated on non-profit institutions is transfers to schools. Now we at a within the let's say head office of education education's budget is determined by a financial year. However, the school is run in terms of a calendar year, and so what the system that the education has put in place over the number of years is in terms of that to ensure that there is no impact on the running of schools. They have then instituted some of the payments in the month of March in order that there is a smooth running within schools, and the financial year of, let's say, the head office is not impacted by the running of the school in a school calendar year. When we move along to the Department of Transport and Public Works on the next slide, Transport and Public Works, again, also impacted by compensation of employees, and then also on the goods and services side, years in terms of delays in terms of the contracted maintenance. And then there's the underspending on transfers and subsidies of about 37 million is due to outstanding rates and taxes and accounts not received from some municipalities. And then also in terms of claims not received for subsidies for construction and maintenance on road infrastructure. The payments for capital assets underspending of 70 million, that is also due to delayed in construction work, really impacted by the lockdown regulations on the industry, and therefore exacerbated in terms of the end of the financial year. On our human settlements, the underspending amounted to 76 million rand, and that is mainly relating to the Provincial Emergency Housing Grant, which we received in the month of March, and also the part of the adjustments budget in March. However, the department was not able to finalize all the procurement procedures that was needed for that, but there's already been a rollover approval for that funding from a national level. When we move on to the next slide. And the next slide is in terms of Provincial Parliament. In terms of the net underspending amounting to 14 million rand, that's mainly relating to compensation of employees of 9 million, of which that compensation of employees is divided into two. One is in terms of posts and vacancies that was not able to be filled, and then also in terms of the direct charges in terms of salary to members, the increase that was budgeted for, as we all know, that was not implemented in the financial year, and therefore that also then culminated in an underspending. When we move along in terms of public entities, the next slide, and public entities on average spent about 89% or 90% of their budget. And then also to indicate to you that the numbers that is presented here is, number one, mainly represented in a cash basis, and therefore some accounting transactions still needs to be accounted for in terms of the numbers that is represented. But from a cash perspective, there was an 83 million rand overall underspending on public entities. When we move to the next slide. In terms of those public entities that make up the most of the underspending, at Westgrove, it was an underspending of about 25 million, and that is mainly on compensation of employees that was impacted due to COVID. But then also on the goods and services side, there was postponement of planned events as a result of the COVID lockdown regulations that never happened, and therefore resulted in underspending. The next slide in terms of public entities, which also showed an underspending, is the Western Cape Liquor Authority. That amounted to 23 million for them. Again, also in terms of compensation of employees, and then also some of the goods and services. Regarding the Gambling and Racing Board, their underspending amounted to about 16 million. And then it relates also to goods and services, well, mainly goods and services. And that was on travel and subsistence, and then also impacted some of the administrative and legal fees. When it comes to Casidra, you'll see there that the underspending amounted to 11 million, and that is again also in COE and goods and services. We're moving to the next slide. And we're looking now at infrastructure, and on the next slide of the infrastructure then indicates to you in terms of the spending outcome of average and for us as a province in terms of what we spent our budget on. So of our 8 billion rand, we spent 7.8 billion rand of our infrastructure. That is about 95.5% of our budget. You can see in terms of the impact that COVID has had on infrastructure spend, especially when you compare that to the previous year, as the slide also indicates. You'll see there in terms of where it has reflected in terms of underspending. It is the same departments that as I have highlighted in terms of has underspent in terms of nominal amounts. In terms of contributing to the most of the underspending for us as a province. You'll see there education, health, and transport and public works. Then moving along in terms of, I mentioned in terms of infrastructure. So infrastructure number one was impacted through, I mentioned reprioritization of the budget, and then also fiscal consolidation in preparation for the severe reductions that we saw as part of the 2021 budget. And so the impact that has had in terms of for a frontline service department to respond to COVID, like the Western Cape Government Health Department, they had to implement obviously several unforeseen priority infrastructure projects. So then within that infrastructure budget, we saw in terms of reprioritization, in terms of responding to COVID. Then further, it also meant that there was some reprioritization away from infrastructure to respond to COVID-19. And when we were starting to respond in terms of the fiscal consolidation for the 2021 budget, which we were preparing for, the impact that it had on infrastructure also, it meant that in that financial year, the one that has just passed, it meant that some of the planning was delayed. It also meant that in terms of some of the projects that were supposed to go out on tender in that part of the financial year, and they were ready ready for tender, they were also then delayed. And that was mainly because of the uncertainty, as I indicated, of the 2021 MTEF. So we were expecting the cuts to be deep in the 2021 MTEF. And so some of the accounting officers, in terms of the PFMA, if you're going to put out the tender, it does mean that you need to confirm that you would have that budget then available over that project period, and therefore the uncertainty that the 2021 MTEF had then impacted in terms of decision making on some of the tenders that was planned for the end of the quarter. Chair, moving along, we're now moving into our revenue part, because that's the expenditure in terms of where we found ourselves. And then on the revenue part, you can then already see in terms of some of the impact, if you remember some of the numbers that we usually mention to you in terms of our over collection. There's been a severe impact of COVID-19 on our collection of revenue. So firstly, in terms of provincial own receipts, you'll see there that in terms of we collected about 159 million rand over collection of our revenue, and that was mainly in terms of the Department of Human Settlements, and then also in terms of the Department of Transport and Public Works, and then Transport and Department of Health, but definitely not at the levels that we saw in previous years. When we look at our receipts now, and this is receipts in terms of gambling and liquor licenses. You'll see that we over-collected there by 84 million rand, with the majority of that coming from gambling taxes. So when we look at in terms of our over-recovery of revenue in total was about 243 million rand. And as I indicated, that is below the previous years when we were average in terms of between 450 and 550 million rand over collection. And that is the impact that COVID has had, especially in the gambling industry and then also in the health in terms of collection of revenue for the health department in terms of the health patient fees. Some of the detail then on the revenue numbers in the next slide. In the departmental revenue, in the middle of the slide, Transport and Public Works, they recorded in terms of in their over collection is mostly on motor vehicle license fees, and that was a collection of about 1.84 billion rand, compared to the 1.8 billion rand compared to 1920. And so that is just in terms of 40 million rand more than what's collected. And then in terms of the other receipts for the other departments on the next slide. The Department of Health, they have their collection amounted to 411 million, which was lower than the 686 in the previous financial year. And this is obviously the impact that COVID has had on their collections, and also then in terms of, and mostly in terms of collections from the Road Accident Fund, that they could not collect in terms of revenue. On the human settlement side, there is in terms of a over collection, and that's mainly in terms of return subsidies from municipalities in terms of grants on the housing and the human settlement grant that was not spent, and then also some on sale of assets and rental income. So, Chair, that's all in terms of the next slide, is that that is the outcome of expenditure. And I now hand over to Ms. Ishmael for the non-financial outcome for the past financial year.
Thank you, Annelies, and welcome again. For the quarter under review for the non-financial performance, this is just a very brief presentation and a few slides on only the progress achieved in terms of overall underperformance, and no substantial analysis of any performance data. So just as an introductory commentary, I also need to note that the advent of COVID of the C19 resulted in adjustment process during the financial year, and this adjustment was around the performance in the around the performance indicators. And just as a reminder, we actually shared that in the previous engagement that we had. But nonetheless, we have also brought in that adjustment when we actually when we actually looked at the annual performance, and when we will actually see that when we do the annual reporting process. So where we are now in terms of the 13 departments and the achievement against the performance indicators, one can see that the number of performance indicators, the target was 639. And I'm just going to zoom into the percentage of the targets achieved. The average, only 77%. If one look at the three clusters, the governance, the social and economic, and one look at the departments that actually resides in that particular cluster, one can actually see in the governance the percentage of targets achieved in the Department of the Premier, actually 90%, Provincial Treasury 82%, local government 89%. When one go look at the social cluster, it is kind of the range is actually quite wide in terms of that average of 77%. And that is just the message that I'm actually pitching today. And if one look at the social cluster, one can actually see community safety with 89%, going down to culture, affairs and sport at actually 78%. And then there is a downward trend in terms of go to education, 67%, health, and then 65%, and then look at social development at 39%. And when one look at the economic cluster, one also see that also that variance, but not such so significantly. And one look at environmental affairs as the achievement of 93%, and if one look at agriculture, 86%, and economic development 80%, with transport and public work 54%. If one go to the next slide, and I'm just comparing those averages in one see, well, so how does the picture look like in the province over the 4 quarters? Actually over the 4 quarters, but first just zooming into this quarter, one can actually see that if one just look at just one indicator, one actually only look at the green bar, one can actually see about 5 departments are under that that average of 77%. When one think back and you actually look at the average performance, just the trends of what we already presented previously, one could actually look at the data. One can actually see that in Q1, there was an average of only 46% achievement, but that was during the advent of COVID, and that was during that adjustment where business plans, as Annalise have actually alluded to, where business plans needed to actually couldn't be implemented as is, and there needed to be adjustments, amendments, and it needed to be augmented. When it then substantially increased to Q2, when one see actually there was a 61% increase. If members could actually just reflect on what we presented previously. Then we went to Q3, and we could actually see a 70% increase, and it actually substantially moved nicely to 84%, Q4 to 77%, and the pre-audit actually shows an average of 75%. It would be interesting, and we're not showing it now, but when we come to the committee again, one can actually look at, so what was the audit performance across the 13 departments historically over the past 3 years. And then actually looking forward, and actually where one need to focus on then, because then one can actually make that kind of a oversight decision making in terms of the consistent overperformance or underperformance, without looking at the quantum at this point in time. Thank you. When one look at the public entities and one tell the same story, one could actually see the number of performance indicator targets 114. The percentage of the targets achieved is, the average is 72%, and the governance 73, no other comparison to other public entity. And one look at the social cluster, one actually see that the Western Cape Heritage and Language have 100% performance. Then it goes down to the liquor, first the Cultural Commission to 67%, and then the Liquor Authority to 63%. On a lighter note, it may be impacted on the alcohol ban. That's only on a lighter note, eh? That's okay. So the cluster, one could actually see that the average achievement there look nicely at the Western Cape Nature 100%, and then the Saldanha 92%, and then one look at the Western Cape Tourism, Trade and Investment at 60% and consider at 48%. On one look at that averages again, and what is the story that's coming through in that average? If one look at the average, the next slide, which is average of 72%, and if one look at the next slide, if you, Annalise, if you could just move it to the next slide for me, please. Thank you. And then one could actually see there's about same storyline, same narrative. If one look at the green bar, then one could actually see there's about 4 departments that achieve below that Western Cape average. When one look at his over the quarters, then one seen Q1, the public entities had an average of 49%. At the time of the advent of COVID, it moved up to 63% in Q2, and then it moved to 77% in Q3, slightly down in Q4, and it stepped up again during pre-audit now, also at 77%. Thank you. Then finally, one more slide just to give this very, very brief synopsis. There's lots that's sitting behind this data, which the departments can definitely share with the committee. Just as a reminder, during the advent of COVID, the whole quarterly performance reporting process actually needed to be adjusted because a number of interventions have taken place which have not been planned, and it did not find resonance. It didn't find place within an annual performance plan. So here, during the adjustments of these have been incorporated into amended annual performance plans. But notwithstanding that, we needed to make provision. So what we have done, it is every quarter on quarter, we have introduced from the first quarter to do a survey to actually supplement the data that comes through the eQPR system. And that was very useful and valuable to actually complement 2 performance data sources to actually present one narrative on the Western Cape government performance. So if one look at both departments and the public entities, there were about 116 interventions implemented by institutions, and those institutions are the 13 departments and the public entities during all quarters of the period under review. 65 or 56% of those interventions were completed in the year under review, while 51 or 44% continued into the next financial year. That means we are currently tracking the performance of those interventions during this current financial year. There are departments and entities that have completed 100% of the interventions, and for this Q4, in fact, 2 new interventions were being implemented, and that were by Department of Health, Department of Premier, Social Development, and Westgrow. So thank you from our side. I think that is it. However, I may want to actually just highlight a few points in terms of underperformance, or the reasons why departments perhaps didn't perform in certain areas, or what was the reasons. I'm just highlighting a few departments in the governance cluster. There was lockdown restrictions, additional interventions that needed to be issued. Also, national disaster lockdown restrictions resulted in schools opening late. Resurgence in the province, which result in outreach being certain outreach programs being suspended, school closures, late awarding of tenders by National Treasury, non-compliance of organizations, dependencies on other stakeholders and demand-driven indicators are kind of the known and has been there historically as reasons for not achieving on a certain performance target. And I'm trying to highlight the new the new reasons that's coming through. Challenges due to land invasions. Few title deeds were registered in the deeds office, and fewer beneficiaries qualified for title deed transfers. And then very much in terms of there were perhaps overachievement in the previous quarter, and it looks as if this quarter is perhaps underperformed, but it's due to achievement that has already been acknowledged during the previous quarter. Very much budget cuts and priorities, and also due to quality performance data, and that means the data has not been verified as yet. And yeah, so and then the normal, the usual demand-driven indicators came through as also as reasons. Thank you, and I trust that this will provide the committee some insights when engaging the departments individually. Thank you from my side.
Thank you so much. I already see one hand going up. Any other hands? Going once, going twice. Okay, Member Mackenzie, you may go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. And I think Ms. Ismail started to answer my question towards the end there. And one will obviously get to the individual department, because I get a sense, and it's not, and it's my perspective on things, you know, when lines read like things like adversely affected by COVID-19, due to COVID-19 regulations, lockdowns, etc. One would like to see specific reasons, either in the notes, like Ms. Ismail started at the end, to say, okay, the reason the Department of Human Settlements, for example, couldn't spend money is on site 734 north of Cape Town. There was land invasion, so the contractor could not start. The reason why Treasury could not spend money, because the road from Cape Town to Beaufort West was closed for 3 weeks, so officials could not get there. That's the sort of level of detail hopefully one can see in the notes that, like I said, the last 2 minutes, Ms. Ishla starts speaking to it, and in the future in all departments, that one don't just get a general sense of adversely affected by COVID-19 due to lockdown regulations, because that doesn't tell me, at least, it doesn't tell me anything. Perhaps because I'm a public rep, I've been on the road and I've been traveling, it's a bit unfair to compare me to other people, but it just doesn't tell me anything. But if it's specific due to site a land invasion on Earth 249, we couldn't do X, Y, Z, that sort of makes more sense. But just a general line due to a lockdown regulation adversely affected by COVID-19, those sort of things doesn't tell me personally anything. And I hope, Chairperson, that as a committee, and I'll also speak to the committees that I'm in, that we need to just remind those that present to us to be specific. Why was X, Y, Z not done? Not just due to lockdown regulations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Perhaps a suggestion, Ms. Ishmael, could be that if it's COVID related, and if it's in particular related to a particular regulation, for example, we all know the schools close during certain weeks. So it could be, for example, that you put a footnote in to say regulation number 1.3.A, school closure, May, date to date 2021. I'm making up numbers now, but it's just a suggestion related to Member Mackenzie's question as well. Member Nkondlo?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Just want to check if in the performance information provided, whether on the entities, the results of the entities, are they already included as the total sum of the performance of the departments where they report to? I see that there is a separate presentation or separate slide on entities, but I just want to check if one looks at that overall, or are they separated in terms of the performance results, which I think is being presented at this point, because one finds also, if you look, for example, at some of the economic cluster type of entities, if you look at some of them, I would want to understand whether that result is included, for example, in DDET, because they are oversighted by DDET as entities. That's the first one. The second one is that I just want to understand in terms of the infrastructure, and I'm asking once again in aggregate terms, in the infrastructure spend or underspending, in total, what would you say is the total amount of underspending on infrastructure projects together, whether from human settlement, whether from transport and public works? I saw the individual numbers. And once you look at them, I hear is the biggest reason, as you say, the delays, which are understandable based on the lockdown. Is that the biggest problem you find in terms of infrastructure spend, which then dictates that in this environment, so long as we have COVID lockdown, we will have to sit with that reality that when it comes to infrastructure projects, you will have such problems of tenders not going out because of whatever reason, or projects not starting because, it's either level 2 or level 5, depending at the time. So I'm interested in both of that, the aggregate amount of underspending of infrastructure projects, and also what, in your view, in terms of the numbers and some of the challenges that actually are a source of such. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. It's one half and half question. One to Provincial Treasury, which is very similar to the one for Premier. I wanted to know the funding that's under expenditure for the fourth quarter. Obviously, we're not in the fourth quarter anymore, but has any of those funds rolled over for this financial year? And if so, how much of that funding has rolled over? And whether spending on that funding has already started, that has rolled over. And then to Premier, the targets obviously is also fourth quarter, and those are prelims. So I wanted to find out if any of the targets that have not been reached been addressed in the quarter since, and how many of them. Thank you so much. Ms. Pick, are you going to go first? Okay, perhaps then Ms.
Apologies, Chair. I was just a bit slow on my. I think is Ms. Ishmael ready to go?
Yeah, I'm just going to ask that the last questions, perhaps if you just could repeat that. I think it was on a project, a question related to the project level, but I actually just want to come in firstly the question on Honourable Member Mackenzie, we in addition to the presentation, and as I said, the presentation, it is give one or two messages, but we do every quarter we submit a quarterly release, and we submit it to Provincial Treasury, and I'm pretty sure it is issued to you, and there is it's about 80-page release with Annexure C, with comments that we receive from the departments and public entities on underperformance indicators. And it actually gives you the program in the particular department, together with the sub-program, the indicator, and then the comments as we receive from the departments. One can always improve on the comments as we receive from the departments. We have put in measures in place to actually get that specifics, and we are starting to get there. But that is where the departments in that release that we issue, one can actually start seeing the reasons why departments not achieve. For example, the underachievement is due to the Chrysalis Academy intake being reduced and so forth. So they are kind of a little more specific, like the department will no longer be pursuing the establishment of an in-house KDOG unit during the current disaster. Funds have been redirected to support the provincial COVID-19 initiatives. So there are those specifics. I've just highlighted the kind of the thematic areas in terms where underperformance are taking place. But happy to in the next presentation, and next time we engage actually to actually show that to extract from that annexures and actually make it part of the presentation. So I will also engage with Annalise on that. So that's the one.
Just, apologies for interrupting you. I just wanted to alert members on Tuesday in our inboxes at 12:09. We also did receive the link to the documentation that you're referring to. Yeah. I just checked now for us quickly. Yeah.
So thank you, and then that's the one. So yeah, so I'll come back to any other responses. Annalise, do you want to go?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Zina. So I'm gonna ask class to Mr. Langenhoven to pick up in terms of the infrastructure question. Chair, then in terms of your question regarding the under expenditure and what amount has been requested for rollover, and then also what amount has been approved thus far for rollover. So as you saw, the preliminary underspending amounted to about 1.3 billion rand. Of that 1.3 billion rand, 674 million rand has been applied for rollover in terms of the PFMA. Of that 674 million rand thus far, it's about 90 million rand from conditional grants has been approved for rollover. Therefore, in terms of service delivery, can continue. And then on the provincial side, in terms of approvals thus far, is about 190 million rand for infrastructure on the education side, in terms of fencing of schools. So that can also then continue in terms of into the new financial year. The funding in terms of that was rolled over for approved for rollover for the Department of Education was mainly funding that was given to them in the second adjustments budget. And so that is in terms of part of the second adjustments budget in terms of responding in terms of a recovery plan at that time, we did indicate to departments that to ensure that there is service delivery and continuity thereof, that we would expedite infrastructure applications for rollover, which culminated then in the approval of the 190 million rand for education. Klaas, just on the question in terms of Member Nkondlo.
Good morning, Honourable Chair, and thank you. Yeah, the net underspending, as I think is on slide 13, amounts to just under 365 million. I think we need to mention just in the response as well that the past year was in particular challenging in terms of COVID-19, and it did send some quite serious shocks through the system, and we as a collective didn't quite understand what the real impact will be at that stage, and accounting officers and head of departments and so forth were very hesitant because we didn't know how the pandemic will unfold and so forth. I think there's a better understanding, and I think this year looks a bit better in terms of spending so far already in terms of the first quarter compared to last year. And I think there's greater certainty, although it might be budgets might be slightly reduced and so forth because of the fiscal position of the country and so forth. But it looks the spending performance looks a bit better. So I think we came to terms with some of the uncertainties and the shocks and so forth as a government, and we really trust that this year going ahead will be smoother than last year. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Ishmael.
Yeah, no, thank you. I will just kind of very briefly go over the other presentations. I mean the other questions. Sorry, I was actually earlier discussion. I wanted to make specific reference to the release, and I was just trying to access that release. So in terms of the question, in terms of the EQ of the quarterly reporting system. Firstly, I actually just want to note that yes, the departments actually give us extensive notes in terms of performance and achievement and underachievement or just deviation. Secondly, in terms of the question around the entities. So yes, they do report separately. Or a particular department may be a parent department, example, Cape Nature and Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning, that's example, or Casidra and Agriculture. So there's definitely a parent department. However, the entity reports separately into the electronic quarterly reporting system, and they do that because they actually have their own annual performance plan, and they actually have their own annual report. Yeah, and then the other response to the question, it is no institution report on a preliminary performance. They actually only report on validated performance. This has been a change since in the quarterly performance reporting system. Previously, the departments did have that privilege, I would say, to actually be able to talk about preliminary, and actually then afterwards, when we go into the next reporting cycle, they can actually look back at the previous reporting cycle, and they can actually say that was the actual validated performance. That has that process in the reporting system, that in the full value chain of the quarterly performance system, that process has been removed. Yeah, so I think I've responded to all. One question Still, I think no, we don't actually do the reporting on a project spin tracking, and that would be where further work. As I say, there's always improvement in terms of the value of performance data, and that would be where one actually look at your performance data and your non-financial performance data, and one actually start looking at the performance, the tracking of your financial and non-financial performance on a particular project. What I can make a suggestion in terms of the how the QPR system work. I'm more than willing, obliged to actually our provincial data office, and Jacques Barnett, he is in the room. He's actually leading on the quarterly performance system, and we can actually do a presentation on how the whole quarterly performance system actually work. It's a rigorous cycle. There is a full value chain, and we're quite rigorous in terms of ensuring good quality performance data. All right, and Ilse Pretorius is also here, and the two of them are very instrumental in making sure that this Western Cape government have good quality performance data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ishmael. And as you may be aware, we are also engaged as a committee in some research on budgets and finances and money bills. So we will probably take you up on that offer in order to have a presentation on the quarterly performance system. Okay, are there any other questions that were missed out? If anyone has a follow-up question or a new question, we still have time for that. Okay, if none, thank you so much to the Provincial Treasury as well as the Department of the Premier for being with us today and for presenting this very important information to us. It's always wonderful having you in committee. And I think as we go along in the respective quarters and the respective years, that we're getting quite acquainted with all of the respective data and information as we go along. So I do thank you. And I wish you all for the rest of your day. Stay warm and stay safe.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to committee members.
Thank you. Members, I'm going to ask if you could just please stay online for just some of the committee business that we still need to deal with. We will do resolutions and actions at the end. Okay, Ms. Kamish Ahmed, if you could assist us with the first document that we need to go through. I think it's the set of minutes, I think. Okay, so we can start with the draft quarterly report then, okay? Let's go a bit down, members. We're going to now then go through the draft quarterly report for January to March. We can just check that everyone's names is spelled correctly. Okay, let's go down, page 1. If no edits, we can go down to page 2. Okay, go down to page 3 to March. Okay, there was a meeting there. We can go down to page 4. Okay, you can just quickly stop there just so that members can check their respective attendance. Just a few seconds there, just so that go a bit up. There we, just so members can see the key as well. There we go, the different little tick box in AB, AP, and AOB. Okay, we can go down. Okay, you can stop there for members quickly. Okay, you can go down. Okay, number 9. Okay, we've had that meeting already, but that's just the reporting on that meeting at the time. Okay, let's go down. 10.1 legislation. 10.2, legislation. Okay. We've already dealt with that legislation just at the time of reporting. That was still on our agenda. We can go down, number 12. Okay. And that was at the end of the first quarter. Yes.
Sorry, I just go a little bit down. It's the budget.
Yes, so that was the balance at the end of the first quarter, which was at the end of March. Let's go down more. Okay, so that's the end. No, there's more. Yes, there we go. Go down.
Yeah, that's it.
There we go. So those are just the totals for the respective line items. Is that the end of the document?
Yes, Chair, and then we'll just share the tracking document along with that.
Okay, let's put up the tracking document quickly for that quarter then.
We're just trying to find it. Apologies, Chair.
That's okay. I think it's also in the little email link that you sent us.
I have it open. It's just it's not showing on my Teams. On the share content. I just need to, because it's open. Budget committee. Okay, Chair, can you see my screen?
I can see your screen, yes.
Okay. Can you see now?
Try and click on opening the document. Okay, there we go. Okay, can we maybe just, it's a little bit small. Thank you. Perfect. Okay. Can we maybe make it like 90% maybe, or 80% so that we can see? Okay, let's go down. That's page 1. Okay, let's just stop there quickly. Quickly go up. Yes, amendment procedures, we've dealt with that already, but at the time of reporting, it was still there, yes. Okay, let's go down. Okay, FFC, yes, we've dealt with that already. But at the time of reporting, yes, that's correct. Yes, public participation still on our list for the upcoming workshop. There we go. Go down. Okay, those are all distributed, so we can go down. Okay, those are all distributed. You can go down. It's at the end of the tracking document. Okay, thank you so much. So members, that is the quarterly report for the first quarter. It's the first quarter, no, January to March. It's actually the last quarter. And with the tracking document then as an annexure. If I could please have a mover for the document with the annexure. Going once. Going twice. Members, are you with me? Thank you, Member Vimbi.
No, there was a stage, Chairperson, where I could not log in. I was trying to raise my hand, and I think I don't know whether my computer frozen or what, but it's fine now.
No problems. We've all had our share of technological challenges today, myself included. Okay, if I could have a seconder for the quarterly report, then please. Going once. Members, are you with me online? Am I frozen?
We're here. Apologies, Chairperson. We are here.
Okay. Cool. Let me just see. Okay. To my knowledge, we only need one mover, but it's always nice having a seconder. Okay, let's go on to the next document.
Seconded, Chairperson.
Thank you. We can go on to the next document then. Okay, so that's April to June. Okay, let's just check our names there quickly. Okay. Everyone's name's correct. Then we can go down to page 2, I mean. Okay. Yes, that's April and May. Let's go down. Yes, we had that meeting. That was the legislation. We can go down. Yes, there was more legislation. You can just stop there for members to read. And let's just quickly put an R in the word chairperson. There we go. Go but down. Okay, you can go down for members. Okay, you can go down. Okay, next page, legislation. Okay, we can go down. Okay, we can go down. You must just remember to put the balance in there. So you're going to have to open your calculator now quickly and say 68 minus 22. And then you get your balance. Miss Adams, are you able to edit on the document?
46164.
There we go. If we can just write that in, please.
164. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let's go down. Okay, so that's the expenditure, the line items. No, go down so members can see. Okay, members also received this document. Okay, let's go to the tracking document then. Remember to save. Okay. Make it just a little bit bigger, please. I don't know where my glasses are today, so I need some assistance. Thank you. Okay, so the first one has been emailed. Okay, let's go down. Let's quickly stop there, just hang on.
Can you just zoom it a bit bigger?
Yes, just a little bit bigger. There we go. Okay.
Chair, so the members saw this in the
first
document,
one.
yes. I just left it in there so that members can have a flow for the year.
Okay, that's fine.
It actually starts from March, and then the new tracking information is from year, Chair, from May.
Okay, that's fine. Distributed, let's see there. Equitable share, we did half of that, but yes, we have the rest on for the next workshop. Let's go down. Okay, those have all been distributed. We can go down then. Okay, distributed. Okay, let's go down. Let's see there. Oh, that was for the November one, which we just reconfirmed for November again. Okay, so that's the tracking document that's at the end of the second quarterly report then. If I could then have a mover for the April to June quarterly report, please. Going once?
Yeah, we agree 100%.
Thank you, Member Mackenzie. If I could have a seconder for the quarterly report.
Seconded.
Thank you so much, Member Mbimbi. Okay, it is so adopted. Let's go to the next set of documents. Okay, that's minutes. Let's see. Okay, perfect. Okay, let's go down, just check surnames and so on. Okay, let's go down. Page 1, page 2. Okay, short minute. Okay, if I could have a mover for the minutes.
I hereby move.
Thank you so much. If there's a seconder for the minutes. Thank you so much. The minutes are then adopted. Okay, do we have any other documents?
No, Chair, that's it. Just members need to just any resolutions and actions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I was just about to get to that. Members, are there any resolutions or actions? I do note that we received information from Ms. Ishmael that she said that she could do a presentation for us on the quarterly performance system. And I think we should probably take her up on that. Other than that, one, are members happy with that? And two, any other resolutions? Going once, going twice. Okay. If those are the only resolutions, thank you so much, members, for attending this budget committee this morning. And thank you so much for being present and interactive this whole week. I'm sure you are tired of my face, so I hope you have a wonderful weekend, that you stay safe and stay warm. The meeting's adjourned. Goodbye.
Bye-bye, Chairperson.